I am so excited to be here with Kate Fagan, the author of the upcoming book, Hoop Muses, An Insider's Guide to Pop Culture and the Women's Game. Does this need any more of an intro? I don't really think so. So the Locked On Women's Basketball podcast, it starts right now.
Ogunbowale for the win.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball.
Hello and welcome. You are locked onto women's basketball. I'm Jackie Powell. I'm one of your Friday hosts. I cover the New York Liberty at The Next, and I help with the Next social media strategy. And I've covered women's basketball nationally at other places as well, at Bleacher Report, WSlam, and many others. Thank you for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. And remember, Locked On Women's Basketball is brought to you by everyone at The Next, a place where we cover women's basketball all the time, and we tell the stories that need to be told every day. And if you subscribe to us, you can get 50% off our partner site, The Equalizer, which covers women's soccer every day. And if you become a paid subscriber of The Next right now, you can get 23% off of our usual price. It's all in honor of the WNBA free agency period that we've just had that has been historic, and how it's become a fixture in the women's pro basketball calendar. Also, Locked On Women's Basketball is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and many more. But now that it's officially March, one of the most exciting times for women's basketball, I wanted to have a conversation with Kate to discuss her book, a book that I don't think anything like it has ever existed before. And the book itself could help us think about women's basketball in the way that it always should have been. Of course, we do this at The Next and at Locked On Women's Basketball every day, but this book is incredibly intersectional. And to me, it feels personal, because my personal entry into the women's basketball space was not always about the game itself. It was about the intersectionality and about what the game represents and its values. And I think this book just does a brilliant job of bringing all of that together. So first, we're going to get to the origins of Hoop Muses, followed by looking at some of its wonderful details. And then we're going to talk about pop culture footprints and why they matter so much. So, okay, Kate, hi, hello. Thank you for being here. That was my mouthful of an intro. I think where I want to start is if you could take me through the moment you spoke about in your acknowledgments in this book, the driving thought. How exactly did this book come to be?
You know, I wish I could say that there was like one specific thought that coalesced that launched it. I remember I called my mom on a walk and I kind of talked her through what I wanted the book to be. And it was definitely born of the idea that a lot of like the history of the game, the mythology of the game, the culture of the game had never or wasn't, there hadn't been any like true investment poured into putting it all in one place and sharing it in the way that you could look at any men's sport and there'd been, coffee table books and photographs, and you could buy limited edition prints of like famous moments in history. And it was definitely kind of like a convergence of my, time at ESPN and different things I'd worked on and feeling like, you know what, maybe I'm going to try this from a new angle. And what if we tried to do something really fun and poppy and exciting and telling a history, but using an awesome illustrator to help make it feel really fresh and new. So that was the start of it. And initially I wasn't initially, I didn't have an illustrator, but the second I saw Sophia Chang's work, I was like, that is definitely the right person for this book. And then I thought it'd be really cool to have like a really insider take on it. And that's when Simone came on board, and it just ended up being like a great team to bring this book to fruition.
I love that. I love that. The illustrations, which we'll get to in a moment, are, I mean, they sort of make the book into a comic book. And there are obviously some parts of it that have comic strips. But I think that the feeling you get when reading it makes me feel like how I felt when I would read DC Comics as a kid. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that's intentional, but I definitely felt that.
Yeah, it was absolutely intentional to bring, well, one, like the sequential art. I came to learn terms I didn't know before, like sequential art as like comic book art. And there was a separate comic book artist from Sophia who created a lot of that comic books and then the comic strips. And yeah, we one of the driving thoughts at the beginning of this book was, if I'm going to, for example, tell the stories of like a 1930s team, which because it's a women's sport, we haven't done like sexy documentaries about it, or like there hasn't been a scripted show about it. There's not like 10 historians who have recounted this for us. So you're often working with like maybe one woman in history who was an archivist and like found this story and told it, but you don't have a plethora of options. So the key thing, and also I didn't want it to be like I'm telling this story from the 1930s and like it's going to be black and white, just by necessity. And I wanted to bring like a very like anachronistic pop to it. And so yeah, it was really important that like Sophia, even if it's a story from the 1890s, something about the way she's illustrating it makes you feel like it's fresh and relevant and new. And that was very purposeful.
Yeah, I love that. And so going to the title of the book, I sort of want to know, how did you land on the phrase Hoop Muse?
Well, I think when we were pitching the book, like before we had a publisher, our stand-in title was Love and Basketball. But we were like, it was always a stand-in title because obviously the movie was so iconic that we were going to have trouble divorcing the book from the movie. People were going to think it was like a companion book or something, but that was our stand-in title. And then even after we sold it and we had our publisher, we were down the line with the publisher trying to come up with like what was going to be our final actual title. And I think it was Simone who tossed out the idea of like looking at mythology and like a very like old history. And I think she might have even said in an email like the Muses or something like that. And so it was definitely Simone's idea to kind of use that phrase. But I was actually against it in the beginning, and for the reason that from a linguistic standpoint, you even did it on when you were introing it. You have to very much concentrate to say Hoop Muses because your brain jumps to the muses, and so you end up saying like Hugh, like it. I had trouble wrapping my mind around it, and then like linguistically, it's a challenging phrase, but it's just eventually it just in my mind it was the perfect title. And even though people like, even though you say it now, like you have to say it on a podcast, but like it's a book, so people are just looking at it. So we ended up going with it, and it grew and grew in my mind as like the perfect title for the book, even though I was reluctant at the outset.
Yeah, I didn't even think about the enunciation of it all, but now that you say it, and now that I remember, I'm like, oh man, okay, that is part of it. You have to say Hoop Muses.
Yeah, you got to stay focused.
Yes. But something I do when I try to look at meaning and significance in all forms is I go to the dictionary. And so I was like, okay, let's look up the dictionary definition for the word muse. And of course, there were two definitions, one that was more mythological. And then there was another that said a person or personified force who is the source of inspiration for a creative artist.
That's the one.
It is the one.
Yeah.
And so I read that definition and I was like, wow. I was like, oh yeah, this makes so much sense because, and you're the author, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's putting these people and ideas in women's basketball history, and it's putting it on like this, I don't know if I want to call it mythological pedestal, but it's putting it on a pedestal that it hasn't really always been on, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean I think if you look at that like actual specific definition, I think in my mind the creative artist who is drawing inspiration from these hoop muses is, not necessarily just a young girl today who loves basketball. Like, she is the creative artist who is stepping into the game and can take inspiration from these hoop muses who have throughout history also, loved the game, shared the game, been a part of it. And so I think that is what Hoop Muses means, right? And it doesn't just have to be like, a young player stepping into the game for the first time who needs to look to history. It's also, I think, because of what you alluded to, because of the fact that this isn't a history that is widely known, that even if you're 70 right now, and loved the game, you might not know some of this. And like you could be the person who's inspired by these women who throughout time and history, to much often social costs, continued playing the game that they loved. So that once we kind of wrapped our minds around how impactful the actual term was, and it became impossible to go any other direction with the title.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And so I think you alluded to this before, but I think I want to expand upon it. Who would you say this book is for, and what would you like it to accomplish?
Well, when we were even out pitching the book before we found the publisher, we had our materials and our pitch deck, and we made it clear that we felt like this book would speak to across generations. Like, this isn't a book for young kids because it's illustrated. Like, we made it clear that this was not like a picture book. Obviously there are pictures in it, but that's not what it was. So I think we even had the language in the pitch deck that, like, both from like a 13-year-old who's just fallen in love with the game through an 80-year-old who wasn't a benefactor of Title IX, but always loved basketball, even if they never got to play it in the way they wanted. We thought the book would speak equally to across those generations. So, I mean, I think if you like pinned me down and you were like, no, you can only pick one demographic, I would probably say that, like, like I would feel like an AAU team would love to gift this book. Or if you were a parent and you had a son or a daughter who had just fallen in love with the game, this book would be perfect for them. But I don't know, it doesn't feel like it's limited. It doesn't feel like it's limited in age frame, and we tried to build it in a way that it wasn't, that it was very sophisticated in its own way across, so that it would appeal even to an older reader.
I love that. I love that. And it's interesting when you said AAU, it brought me back to covering high school girls basketball before the pandemic. And I would remember interviewing some of these young kids, and they'd be like, oh my God, we felt like we were the Golden State Warriors out there. And I was like, well,
what about?
Did you watch the Washington Mystics in 2019 and see how they won the WNBA championship? I didn't say it in those exact words, but that was what I was thinking. And so I think about how we address going at that gap or going at that issue. I mean, I remember seeing a tweet from Kurt Miller. I think it was maybe right around WNBA draft time this past year in 2022. And he was basically talking about how during his draft interviews, he felt like not a lot of the people he was talking to had a really good grasp on the league's history and on the league they were going to be employed by, and who built it, and who were some of the older faces that aren't the most obvious, and even the role players in the league that aren't as known. So I feel like this book, and based on what you've said, it's sort of a way to attack that problem that's existed for years.
Yeah. Well, because the problem you're articulating is like the age-old issue of like of cultural capital or cultural significance, in that I don't blame young girls who are on AAU teams or even college teams who see what the culture values within their game and use those cultural references, because if you look at the lineage of the women's game, there have been so few moments where they were celebrated and honored and held up as culturally relevant. And if you're anybody who follows sports, like part of why we love sports and follow it is because you want to be part of the culture. You want, like, whether it's like whether it's your friends group or whether it's the larger culture, you want to know the cultural references. And so when women's sports has historically been excluded from that, the end result is that young girls growing up playing the game, for example, are going to connect more with having a poster of Steph Curry than a poster of, Asia Wilson, or I think that is changing though. And part of what the motivation with this book was to really celebrate and show the culture of, in this case, the women's game, as like this really, really dynamic culture built on this beautiful, really interesting history. And to it's not like it's going to fix the problem, but it's one piece of trying to solve that problem of why are you referring culturally to Steph Curry instead of Chelsea Gray? Like, there's a reason you're doing that, and I'm not blaming you because it makes sense why you're doing it, but like, we need to close that gap that you see as much cultural value in name checking Chelsea Gray as you see in name checking Steph Curry. And all of that, like, that is not a single problem to solve where like one button can be pressed to solve it. It's like chipping away at the culture that has been created around that hasn't been created around women's basketball, that we need to kind of build up now.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because when you open up the first couple of pages, or the cold open, as you call it, you're introduced to the story of Jacqueline Jones, who is a fictional player in was it the year like 2072? I'm trying to remember.
2072, that's right. Yep.
And so the narrative that is played out in this cold open is that Jacqueline Jones is one of these young people who didn't know who Maya Moore was, who she was being compared to in the cold open. And so I guess I just wonder, is there sort of a feeling you have where you're like, wow, we hope that that's not the reality in 2072?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard because it's like you need that kind of like structural premise to like take you through the book, is like becomes the engine of the book. But then ironically, the whole purpose of the book is to keep that future from actually happening like that.
Yep.
So, it's kind of like this, like, I don't know, I guess you could go down a black hole, right? Like, well,
Yes.
if we actually did our job, then Jacqueline Jones in the future would know Maya Moore. But I think, but more than anything, what it was alluding to is twofold. I don't think male athletes are exempt from being ignorant of their own history. It's not a gendered issue.
Yep.
It's not necessarily the wealth of knowledge, or just the appetite for that knowledge is not always there. But I do think there's the second part of that, which is that, so it's not a gendered issue, but if you wanted to know the history of your game as a female athlete right now, I mean, you'd have to do a lot of work. You'd be piecing a lot of things together. Like, you couldn't just Google one thing and have your answer. There's just that information is not readily accessible. And so I think that it was part of like when we made this book, we were like, we want to mythologize the women's game, because mythologizing our sports is part of what we do that creates connection and lineage and family ties and cultural ties. Like, we mythologize our sports, and we don't do that in women's sports, or we very rarely do it in women's sports. And when we do, it has a profound effect. There's a reason that almost every conversation you have about sports, somebody name checks the 99 women's soccer team. Yeah, right? Like, because we've mythologized them at this point. They've had their 30 for 30 documentary, and that so rarely happens in women's sports, but you can see the power when it does.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, coming up, we're going to discuss some of the remarkable history that's in Hoop Muses and sort of go into how Kate structured the book. But first, I want to discuss Nissan's most electric player of the week, and that is brought to you by the all-new 2023 Nissan Ariya. So I had a lot of difficulty trying to figure out who would be the player of the week. Last week, it was Nalissa Smith, because she was absolutely brilliant during Athletes Unlimited. So I decided, in honor of Hoop Muses, I would give the award to Jacqueline Jones. I've never seen her play in my life, but the way in which she was described in Hoop Muses, it sounds like she's someone who will be inducted to the future W75 group. And so, to expand upon that context, in the cold open of the book, Simone Augustus is the person who comes to Jacqueline and brings her through this journey of women's basketball. And she didn't even understand Mone's comp, My Amour, which, such a compliment, and was almost blasphemy. But anyway, Jacqueline Jones exudes a fiercelessness in her moves and ability to score everywhere. Her drives, when she puts the ball on the floor, have a fierceness and elegance that fictional New York Liberty fans notice immediately in the future, in 2072. But just like the Ariya, which delivers on duality with its combo of fierceness and elegance, it is also a strong and the perfect SUV crossover. Jacqueline Jones, or someone like her, is also a player who doesn't just get it done offensively. She's a two-way threat that gets it done at both ends, just like the Nissan Ariya. The 2023 Nissan Ariya packs pin-to-your-seat power and premium intelligence, all in on an electronic vehicle. The all-new, all-electric 2023 Nissan Ariya, the electronic vehicle for people who love to drive. Shop now at nissanusa.com. Okay, and back to the program we go. So I think from close to the beginning to around page 142 is some of this incredible history that I just had never even heard of. I mean, maybe there was some of it that I read in this other book. It was by Andrew Mariness, Inaugural Ballers, that came out recently. But that was just like a tiny bit of context to get you to understand the gold medal team that he describes in his book. But I mean, the folks at Fort Shaw, oh my God. I read that and I was like, so there has to be an Oscar-nominated movie about the people at Fort Shaw.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I just, where is this movie? So I guess what I want to ask you is, there obviously was so much more history that you probably couldn't include. And so how did you decide what to include and what not to?
I think I know I all along felt like there was going to be room for as many people as I could find. All right. So it wasn't like I was going to leave somebody out or a story out or a team out who had done something amazing. So my parameters ended up being a deadline. Like at some point we had to send the book to the publisher, and then my ability during that time period to uncover as much as I could uncover. And so that was really the only parameters. It wasn't like there were teams that, I heard about who had really cool stories and I was like, yeah, they don't make the cut. It was more like, okay, deadline to the printer, bunch of things happen after that, right? Like Brittany Griner comes home from Russia. We don't have, we can't update the book there.
Yeah.
Brianna Stewart goes to New York, and then Candace Parker goes to Los Angeles. Do I wish I had a chapter on like super teams in the WNBA or like the summer of 2023? Like, yes. And then there was like, so the limitations ended up being my own ability to find these stories, because like you'll notice like, there's a huge chunk where I'm missing these iconic AAU teams, like not the AAU we know of now, but the way the AAU used to be structured, which ran women's basketball in like the 1940s and 50s. And like, there was teams like that were associated with companies or they were associated with colleges, but not like we know them now. Like you could play on these teams for 10, 11 years. There was no like 4-year, you didn't have to go to school there. So it was like this association that is foreign to us in the modern era of basketball. But I didn't find out about these teams until like I found this book called Shattering the Glass. And so then you'll see that like I worked a lot of these teams into the end chapters of the book, because we were past the time of being able to like lay out full chapters for them. So the parameters of like who got into the book and who didn't, like I wish there was a scientific way I used, but a lot of it was just like trying to get as much into the book as possible. And then like it's like one specific thing was like, like I think Katie Smith's amazing, and I loved watching her at Ohio State and New York, but there was no specific story around Katie Smith that I needed to write a whole chapter. And so then it was because of Katie Smith that I included like the artist who drew the top 25 WNBA players of the last 25 years. Because I was like, there's no way Katie Smith doesn't get in the book at all.
Yep.
But I don't know a whole essay I need to write about her. And so it was like every moment where I saw somebody, I was like, well, they have to make the book. What can I build to make sure that like at least their name and face is in the book? That was kind of like my very ad hoc way of getting this book done.
For sure. I mean, oh man, I feel like there's a narrative around Katie Smith, and mind you, I covered her it was a season when she was coaching the Liberty in 2019, but there's like this narrative about like, oh man, like we can't forget about her. Like I feel like maybe it was on the Diana Taurasi Sue Bird COVID series that everyone loved, and they were asking each other questions, and one of them asked the other, who's a player who was just so tough or, was underappreciated. And it was Katie Smith who came to DT's mind. So it's.
And there's women like that at every turn that I found. But like, you look at Katie and she was, her team at Ohio State was the runner-up to Cheryl Swoops' team in the title game, where Cheryl scores, I think it was 43 points. So it's like, you can almost kind of look and see, and she played at Ohio State, which obviously they were really good, but they didn't have that media star power that a Tennessee or a UConn had. So like, you see all these reasons why at times she didn't get the same shine as other players. And I just didn't, part of the reason of having like Simone curate it was like, I didn't want to forget that person, like Deanna Nolan doesn't have her own essay, but there's an essay on the Detroit Shock And if you ask WNBA players, like she's top 3 of underrated players of all time. And so I just like include that in the book, like just as an asterisk, like also FYI, you should know Diana Nolan was a baller. And if you don't know her, it's not a fault of hers. It's a fault of our societal structure. FYI, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. There were parts of this book where I read it and I was like, oh, that's the reason why XYZ is like this. And so the part I'm referring to was the Euro Life section. And so the fact that I was able to see, oh, their league started so early compared to ours.
Yep.
Because I've been trying to think, well, obviously WNBA prioritization is coming at us fast and furiously. And I've been thinking about this interesting prisoner's dilemma that exists between the WNBA and FIBA. And I'm like, well, why does this exist? Why is there such an issue with the WNBA saying that it has the upper hand because it is the best league in the world? And then it dawns on me, it's like, well, those international leagues have been around longer. So that is their marker on all of this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like you got Cynthia Cooper, for example, and now she has other issues around her given her college coaching, but like who's playing in Italy, in Spain, in the late 80s and early 90s when we didn't even have a league here. And so, you know, there's all kinds of that which I hope is kind of peppered throughout the book of, yes, this is history, but it's really relevant to where our game is right now, why it is the way it is, what hurdles it faces, as well as what assets it has. Like you can trace those things back, whether it's the NCAA and their takeover of the AIAW. Like there's so much history that informs why things happen the way they do now, which is just the biggest cliche in the world, right? Like if you want to learn about the future, look at the history. But like in this case, we haven't necessarily had that opportunity in women's basketball to truly like look back and learn from it to assess where we need to be going.
Yeah, and the other question that I sort of found myself thinking, okay, maybe there's an answer to this, that I've been looking for this answer for years. And I think that was when I got to the section on Spartak in Russia. And I've always been saying to myself, well, it's so strange that countries like Russia, Turkey, Hungary, they're not the most liberal countries, but they have chosen to invest in the women's basketball world, which we associate with more progressive ideas, and it's a progressive activity. And so I've always sort of been like, well, I just don't understand. There's that weird cognitive dissonance. And
yeah. Oh, did you come up with an answer?
Well, I think it was that I think from some other research, I've found that the issue in the United States is the hard salary cap. And I'm sure that when the new CBA gets negotiated, that will be something that is discussed, because international teams, those ownership groups can spend as much as they want.
Yeah. And I think there's another sort of it wasn't until working on this book, because I spent a lot of my career at ESPN trying to answer the question of like, how is it possible that a Russian oligarch is willing to spend $1 million on Diana Taurasi, and the United States, we don't? Like, how is that possible, right? And like, what is the model that they are employing to allow this to happen? Like, I have been to Russia numerous times, to China when Maya Moore was playing in China, and to try to answer this question. And I never really got an answer that satisfied me fully. But one thing I realized in researching this book more than reporting it was like, so here's a simple fact that blew my mind, which is that I'm from New York. That's not the fact. although it's related to New York. New York State was the last state in the United States to start a women's high school basketball state tournament. Now that surprises me because everybody associates New York with like progressive, like they're out ahead of all of these issues. But actually what you find when you go in the history of, in this case, women's basketball, is that it was small, rural, often southern, sometimes Oklahoma, Arkansas, Iowa, these small towns that cared about the women's game because it was seen as like a community event. And at every turn, before the larger idea that it was unladylike or unhealthy for women or not societally acceptable, local people in all of these small towns would go to the women's games in as high of numbers as would go to the local boys' high school games. And so I think there's something, and I'm relating this to kind of the European question, like, because one thing that was told to me, whether it was in Moscow or Ekaterinburg, where Diana and Brittany played for a number of years, owned by an oligarch, but it was a mining company. Yeah. And one of the things they were like was like, these are just local people, and it's something for them to do in Ekaterinburg, to like be with their families, to get out of the house, to be warm. Sometimes it's really simple. And I think I don't know, I'm sure, I mean, there's a lot of more geopolitical answers to this about why Russia supports women's basketball, or like the club structure of soccer and then other sports that are often under this club structure. Some of that is true, but sometimes I'm like, maybe it's more fundamentally simple, in that if you're in a small town and this is a thing that you want to do with your family or more community, that is a foundational piece that I've now come to accept as like part of the history of the women's game in the US, and perhaps relevant to how we look at it elsewhere.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. I mean, when I also think about the European question and sort of why that is the way it is, I also tend to think about oh man, don't tell me I lost my train of thought. Well, to transition.
Yeah. It happens.
It does happen. It absolutely does. I mean, who knows? Maybe I'll think of it in.
It'll come.
in 30 seconds, but it's so many times during, obviously, the 10 months when Brittany Griner was detained in Russia, people would ask me, they would say, well, why is she over there? And so, a lot of people didn't understand that the treatment over there, the treatment in one of the most repressive countries in the world for someone like BG before her detainment, was actually quite good. And it's a question that I think will continue to be, I guess, answered, hopefully, because it's an important one.
Yeah.
So coming up, we're going to discuss a term that I love, and I don't even know if it's a real one, but I just sort of started using it. But we're going to talk about pop cultural footprints and how much it relates to Hoop Muses and how we can get to that future with Jacqueline Jones celebrating WNBA 75. But first, so I'm someone who gets a bit hangry when I don't eat every 3 to 4 hours. It's not always the best when you are someone who covers women's basketball and is on press row during various times during the day. More recently, doing nonstop writing and reporting during WNBA free agency. Sometimes I value getting my work done over eating a full meal. It is not good, but we are human. So what do I turn to make sure that I can not only function physically, but mentally too? I'm talking about Built Bar, which eases a lot of the hangry and uneasy Jackie moments. So what makes Built Bar so good? Well, for starters, they are covered in 100% real chocolate. That's right, real chocolate. And they come in unbelievable flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, and coconut almond. I'm not sure how Built does it, but these bars taste like candy while maintaining amazing macros. And what's even better is that they're healthy, only 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, and a whopping 17 grams of protein. And you don't need to wait around to get a box. For years, we've been talking about ordering Built bars at built.com, but now you can get them at your local Walmart or Sam's Club. That's right. Head to your nearest Walmart today, walk into the pharmacy section, and grab yourself a box of Built bars. You can pick up a 4-box of cookies and cream, double chocolate, or coconut puffs. You can also find a 13-bar box at your nearest Sam's Club. You can thank me and our friend of the show, Grandma Myrna, later. All right, now back to our program. So one of the things that I appreciate the most about Hoop Muses is its relationship with history and pop culture. And so I want to kick it off to you, Kate, and I sort of want to understand how you think these two elements are feeding off of each other in the book.
So I think I took a page out of just recent WNBA history in terms of how much traction and interest people have in, say, like GQ Sports Instagram about like the walk from the bus to the locker room and fashion. And that was a driving element right from the outset of like trying to even sell this book. We had a bunch of ideas included. Some we just ran out of illustration time and space. Like we actually wanted to do a fashion walk-in through the ages, where we even reimagined, let's say, like Cheryl Miller in the 70s or 80s walking into a game, like what the fashion of the 80s would have been, and like Sophia was going to illustrate these things. We just kind of ran out of time and space and all of that. So, but with the jumping off point of seeing how much fans of the W, whether they were avid or casual, how much they connected with the culture around the game as much as being invested in the X's and O's. I knew that I wanted to show that the culture of women's basketball was really rich in its own right, and also reimagine what that culture would have been like if it was given the same opportunities that men's sports was given, and being able to reimagine a history where Hollywood treated women's sports like it treats men's sports, and how much value that offers culturally, as well as like video games and other assets like that. And so I think that was a key part of the book. And I think some of those ideas that we weren't necessarily able to execute on in this one, maybe we like do a volume 2 or something like that. But regardless of whether we do, the concept of making sure people understood how rich the culture of the game was, and also how the surrounding culture impacts how you see women's sports, was like a founding idea in Hoop Muses, that we wanted to like reimagine things as well as celebrate what was in a really stylistic way.
Right.
Yeah.
And so when I think about this term that I mentioned before, this pop cultural footprint, the thing that I've connected it to is who exactly is vocal and who is really caring about women's basketball and the WNBA, how it affects those people. Something that I would go around saying to people, colleagues and friends, and I even said it to Sabrina Ionescu, and she had no idea what I was saying, so I had to explain to her what I meant. Mm-hmm. I said, well, where have all the Joan Jetts gone? And so what I meant by that was the New York Liberty, actually, they released a documentary. It was last June, called Unfinished Business, and it was, the title is based on the song that Joan Jett, I think, wrote about or for them. But it's sort of this this tale of Joan Jett sitting at Madison Square Garden with a voodoo doll cheering for the Liberty. I mean, this is a memory that current head coach Sandy Brondello, it is stuck in her brain. She would come out, she was playing, I think, for the Soul at the time. She would look to her left and she'd see Joan Jett sitting courtside with the voodoo doll representing her team. And so my whole thing is, well, where are these people that are not just famous, but people that carry pop cultural significance? Where are they in coming out to support the W and be a part of it? That's a question that I've been asking a lot lately.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really important question. I think I have like kind of two thoughts that come to mind. One is that, you know, you see when pop culture and sports intersect, the energy is kind of multiplied in the effect of it. Kind of like the easiest example for like a former New Yorker is Spike Lee sitting courtside at Knicks games. Like there's a multiplying effect on what that does for the Knicks and what that does for Spike Lee. It's like a mutual sort of sharing of capital.
Yep.
And, you know, I was kind of having this conversation with like certain female athletes about how they need to spend their cultural capital on supporting women's sports, because too often we've seen female athletes who maybe like transcend in some way. They need to then like show people that they think women's sports are cool, not that they're now elevated above it, but that they're actually part of it and sharing it. And so I agree with you completely on like, you know, we can't, when I say we, I mean women's sports, but women's sports can't rely on like always needing Chris Paul and LeBron James to like, you know, to be able to do that work for them. Not that I don't think that that's important. It's just like having Chance the Rapper at Chicago's games is that multiplying effect. But I will say what I find interesting about this is like my wife and I never watched the L Word growing up, like iconic Showtime, not growing up, but I was in my 20s, the iconic Showtime show. And we're rewatching it now, and it gets to like season 2, season 3. And the cast of the L Words, and this was probably 2005, the cast of the L Word, one of their members is a big women's basketball fan, and the group takes her to a professional women's basketball game. And it's a made-up team and a made-up arena. And you get the impression very clearly that the WNBA was not willing to allow a real team to be used and a real arena to be used in the filming of the L Word. And so I think that there's like a catch-up thing that's happening, you know, like where I kind of blame the WNBA for a chunk of this, where like from your outset until basically 2015, 2016, like the icons that wanted to be associated with you didn't want to be associated with. So like there's also, I see there's more blame to go around than just like the culture doesn't care, which I obviously feel like we have come a long way, and there's like certain things the W couldn't have done no matter what it wanted to do during certain periods of its history. But I think that there were cultural icons who wanted to be connected to it, and the W was like, you're not the right kind of cultural icons. And so I think that there's some catching up to do around that as well.
That's fascinating. I mean, that example, it takes me down the rabbit hole of talking about the lack of fictional storytelling we have for women's basketball. I feel like we could do an entire podcast about just that.
Yes, for sure.
But I think an interesting story that I've come across in asking current WNBA players about this whole pop cultural footprint thing is that this does matter to them. I mean, Betnijah Laney, I know I keep bringing up the New York Liberty, but this is a team I've
covered your wheelhouse
for years. Betnijah Laney has a dream, and her dream is to be playing at Barclays and to see Beyonce sitting courtside, holding or wearing her jersey. this is a dream that she has had for a while. Whenever I bring up Beyonce, she is more than willing to engage because in her mind, she keeps saying, well, if you guys keep talking about this, then maybe she'll come.
Yep.
But it's something I think about a lot. I mean, I think about the fact that there's that iconic picture of Beyonce in the old New York Liberty jersey, right? And so it's like, okay, well, why don't you come
only
back?
one step farther? Come to a game.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's like, there was, I think, a time, it was a year ago, where Benija was in market on a league and team marketing deal, and Jay-Z came to see the Nets. And so Clara Wu Tsai made sure to facilitate the two of them meeting each other. And I think Benija tried to pitch to him, like, come to one of our games.
Yeah.
And so I just wonder, what is it going to take to get like huge names at WNBA games? I mean, I don't want to say that like SNL's Punky Johnson is not cool to see at Barclays Center. I was very happy to see her when I was covering a game, but I just wonder what has to happen.
Some of it, I think, is just like a light bulb going off, because I think, like, it's not. I understand why famous people go to courtside to NBA, but there's a part of me, like I said earlier, that's like, okay, you are using your cultural capital on this thing that doesn't need you. And like, so I'm not saying don't go to NBA games, but I'm like, if Beyonce showed up to one Liberty game, the sharing of what Beyonce is elevates the WNBA and is so impactful and has ripple effects. Whereas like, she goes to a Nets game, like, okay, it just, like, I think it matters, because then people start buying tickets to Nets games being like, I'm part of this thing, and maybe Beyonce is going, so it's just like when a club has a line outside of it, you're like, oh, that's a cool club to go to. And I think it probably hasn't even occurred to Beyonce that like she could go to one single Liberty game and like the ripple effects would be well worth her time in terms of impact for not just women, but Black women. But I don't even think that light bulb has gone off. I mean, I don't know Beyonce, so maybe it has, and she's like, but I don't want to go. Like, no one knows. But I think some of it is just realizing what I'm doing when I share a story when I'm at a Knicks game is I'm trying to show people I'm cool because I'm at a Knicks game. And I'm like, but I need to understand that, like, I don't think this is true for me, but if I have a lot of value in cultural, like, people think I'm cool, well, then I need to share that. I can't just always be trying to get it, And so, and I think people, like, I think that's why you're seeing a lot of NBA players start to talk about and post about the W's, because they're starting to realize that, like, the juice is worth the squeeze. Like, you go to one game and it's so important for the league and those women, and it looks good for you. Like, we have an element in the book about sitting President Barack Obama going to a Mystics game, the first sitting president to ever go to a W game. That was one night of his life, and it was the first time a sitting president had gone to a W game. And so it's like, this is important enough that I attend, is like a huge statement to make.
Yeah. I just wonder, again, it's like, you put it perfectly. When does the light bulb go on? I mean, these are things that...
Did I say off? I meant on.
Or
yeah.
On.
Yeah, I think I said off, but we want the light bulb to go on.
We want it to go on.
Yes.
And so it sort of makes me think, well, I don't know. Does it take this whole narrative of WNBA super teams to sort of wake people up and be like, oh, like, okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I'm like, it's not like I think super teams were good for the NBA during one period of time. I no longer need a super team. In fact, I would actively encourage against a super team in the NBA. But during a moment of time, it was like this storyline that just disseminated across the world instantly. Like the Miami Heat, bam, you knew everything. And I think the WNBA is in this like inflection point moment as well.
Yep.
And to head into this 2023 season with this storyline that is like on a silver platter. So you've got people that are like curious, or to use like my mom's favorite phrase, she jokes, curious adjacent. You know, it's a very like modern, like I don't have to be like, okay, well, so there's this player and she went to like, it's not hard to transmit. You're like, the Liberty have never won a title and now they have the best player in the world. And the Las Vegas Aces have a stacked lineup, and it's glitzy Las Vegas against media center of the world. Like, that's all you need to know. And I think the WNBA is in this moment where I think that's a really, really powerful storyline for them that people who maybe haven't tuned into the WNBA yet can understand really quickly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Kate, thank you, but also
thank you.
thank you to our listeners for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. And so, yes, Kate, I want to give you a huge thank you for hopping onto today's show. And for our listeners, join us tomorrow, where Hunter Cruz and M. Adler are back for our Saturday WNBA draft themed show. And just a programming note, Natalie Heverin was at the A10 tournament today, hence why I'm here 2 weeks in a row. But she will be back next week, and the next time I'll be with y'all will be March 31st. So everyone, enjoy March Madness. Now make your second listen game to game NBA. Every moment, every top performance, every result. Locked On Game to Game covers every game from across the NBA with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Before we sign off, I just want to remind y'all that Hoop Muses officially comes out on March 7th. Yes. So that is coming up very soon. Make sure you all pre-order it. And this is Jackie Powell and Kate Fagan wishing you a wonderful rest of your Friday. So thank you all.
Ogumbawale for the win. Good!
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball.